Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about something that really is basic and it's very much a part of basic lifting, and that's a lifting belt. But I think it's appropriate for us to understand why it is that we wear a lifting belt. And we do so to, number one, help us lift more weight, and in some cases, reduce fatigue from axial loading from a recovery perspective. So people need to understand these points, and we don't wear a lifting belt to protect your lower back. And what I want to make very, very clear there is that a lifting belt will not protect your lower back. In fact, there's no data to even suggest that wearing the belt will reduce back injury rates. And most lower back injuries come from fatigue, right? It's usually a weak core, weak abdominals, combined with fatigue or just training fatigue. Like in my case, I've only had one back injury in my entire life related to lifting, and it was actually around the start of this year. But in my case, I had extraneous factors going on. And for people who are like, well, what do you mean? It wasn't my training per se that got me hurt. It was the fact that I had had an infection in my foot. I had stepped on something, and then my foot got infected, and I had to get it drained. And because I had that abscess in the bottom of my foot, I was still trying to squat and do all this training with that situation. And it ended up causing me to side load to one side because I was using compensatory strength. And the ironic part is that I was actually using light weight. I wasn't even lifting heavy when it happened. Right? I was actually in a very light phase of training doing pause squats. And that's when I pulled my lower back. And that's literally the only time I've ever pulled or strained an erector in my entire life. And of course, I've rehabbed it because all this footage is done later, and this is not even max work. This is just my back off singles on all these lifts. But the point is, the belt doesn't protect you from that. It's usually something going wrong in your training. Weak core, either something has happened with compensatory strength or it's just a straight overuse injury, right? That's usually what causes lower back injuries. And a belt is not going to help with that. So why do we wear a belt? Well, a belt helps us lift more weight. And when I say it helps us lift more weight, what people need to understand is that there's more than one thing that helps you lift weight on a given exercise, assuming you're using the same form, range of motion, technique, everything else. Usually it's either neuromuscular efficiency in some way or an external object storing external energy that can then be applied back towards your body or the weight in some way to help you lift it. An example of that would be knee wraps. Right? And that's not the same as wrist wraps. Knee wraps or elbow wraps would be a perfect example. Why? Because when you lower the weight, like let's say on a squat, you lower the weight, that wrap is wrapped around your knee. You're compressing the wrap behind your knee, and it's creating like a big slingshot effect behind the knee joint because you're balling that up and it's compressing, and then that wrap compresses upward against your hamstring and helps you lift more weight. Now, incidentally, every person I've ever seen in my life who got a hamstring tear from squatting got it while wearing knee wraps. And that's no coincidence. And it shouldn't be a coincidence. It makes sense when you think about it. So that's an external object that helps you lift. And then obviously things like suits and everything else. But with a belt, what are we doing? Well, a belt lets you brace your core against the belt. Now, is it automatic? No, it's something you have to learn to do. But when you brace your core against that belt, it raises intra-abdominal pressure. Well, why is that important? Well, we'll get to the axial loading part in a minute, but what about even on a bench press, like I'm wearing a belt to bench with? Well, it increases neuromuscular efficiency. The same way like when you have, some coaches will tell you to squeeze the bar as hard as you can on a bench press or an overhead press or anything else. Not even a grip-related exercise, right? I mean, that makes sense on a pull-up. Makes sense on a deadlift. It makes sense on a row to squeeze the bar because you're gripping it. And we know that carries over. But on a bench press or an overhead press, squeezing the bar as hard as possible will sometimes let you lift a little bit more weight. And it's not a lot. It's a very subtle difference. But it could be the difference between 5 or 10 pounds. Or it's the difference between taking your 5 rep max and getting a 6 rep with it. It helps. And it's because it raises neuromuscular efficiency because your body is tighter and you get what's called a radiant effect. Meaning the harder you contract a muscle in the body, any muscle, the easier it is to contract other muscles at the same time. In other words, our body is a unit. Like this is why you have to laugh at bodybuilders with this word isolation. That's a completely make-believe fantasy term. There is no such thing in a human body. There is literally no such thing as isolating a muscle, at least voluntarily. It could be done under laboratory conditions with machines, but your brain isn't capable of doing it. The human brain is not capable of isolating muscles. So the reality is, anytime you can brace or squeeze any muscle in your body, you're going to be able to contract other muscles even harder. Well, that applies to your core, and it very much applies to your core. Things like your grip and things like your abs are really high on that list of the ability to do that. Why? Well, because there's a radiant effect. And because the core is in the center of the body, that effect can radiate to anywhere else in the body relatively easily. So what ends up happening is that when you press your abs against that belt, it can improve neuromuscular efficiency through the entire body. So that matters even on a bench press, doesn't it? You might be able to bench 5 more pounds. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but when we're fighting for 5-pound increases here and there, that matters. And the difference is that you're lifting more weight not through something helping you move the weight physically, like wraps or a suit. You're doing it because your muscles are firing harder. Well, if your muscles are firing harder, that's what we want from a training perspective, right? That's what we want. Well, what about bigger exercises like the squat and the deadlift? What's worth even more? You're going to get more than 5 pounds out of those with a belt because we're dealing with a couple of things, aren't we? Number one, we're dealing with that radiant effect. But number two, we're dealing with exercises in which the belt will affect bar path. Because if you are slightly more stable, because that's what's going to happen, you can stay slightly more upright. You can maintain a stronger stability in your position of your torso because the belt is also increasing intra-abdominal pressure. All right? And that intra-abdominal pressure affects your spine. Well, that allows us to be slightly more upright. It can help us get a perfect leverage position a little bit better. Well, that's one reason a lot of times we can do 20 pounds more, in some cases 30 pounds more, maybe some people even more than that. It depends upon the lift, the person, their technique. We can get more out of these lifts. And we do so because it gives us a more efficient bar path. We're losing less energy, bleeding energy trying to maintain an upright torso. Not to say that we don't need that. I mean, when you got 500 pounds on your back, believe me, you absolutely have to utilize energy to maintain an upright torso, but the belt will make it easier. Belt will absolutely make it easier. So therefore we can lift more weight. Well, for again, things like your legs, quads, hamstring, glutes, hips, all that stuff, they're going to be able to work a little harder, right? They're going to be able to do their job easier. So from a development perspective, it does make sense to do that. It makes sense to do that. Well, what about a recovery perspective? All right, now that's an important point because normally, what would we say? Well, if doing this on your bench press or any other lift lets you lift more weight, it's also going to dig deeper into your recovery, right? Well, yeah, that's true because more work always has more stress, right? More work has its own stress effect. So even if you lift 5 pounds more for all your work sets, yeah, that's going to be slightly harder to recover from. But axial loading and compression of the spine has its own recovery element, doesn't it? Well, what happens when you're wearing a belt that improves intra-abdominal pressure slightly and gives you more support to the spine? Well, there's a little bit less stress put on the spine. Is it a large difference? No, but it is a subtle difference. However, when we're dealing with very large volumes of training with big lifts, not for novice lifters, I'm talking more advanced lifters, when you start getting strong, you can absolutely bury yourself on recovery through axial loading exercises. The belt reduces that slightly. So by using the belt, not only are you going to be able to lift more weight on those lifts, you're going to be able to recover from it slightly easier, which means you can probably squeeze in one or two more sets every week without overreaching or without overtraining. Well, that's a good thing. So there's a big benefit right there also. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.